So, Wattson. Wattson's gym battle is one of the most infamous in the entire Pokemon series. There are definitely others that are more difficult, at least in a vacuum. In fact, even saying Wattson is difficult at all, I don't think would be entirely correct. No matter how few, there are Pokemon available to the player that consistently sweep his entire team. However, I don't think there is another gym leader that completely warps the entire meta of the single-player campaign that features him to nearly the same degree he does. Even in the most casual of playthroughs, you basically have to plan your team around his fight from the very start of the adventure, lest he becomes a practically impassable blockade. In Nuzlocke, there are Pokemon that, despite not really being standouts or even being outright bad otherwise, are widely considered some of the most desirable encounters in the game purely because they're good against him. If Wattson were the first gym leader, and the only Pokemon available to the player were the starters and like 5 others, this would be fairly normal, especially by the standards of the older games. But Wattson is the third gym leader, who you encounter several hours in during a typical playthrough, and there are nearly 40 Pokemon available to the player prior to this gym. Yes, there are a select few that turn the fight into a complete joke, but if you're playing blind, or you're playing in Nuzlocke where you don't have control over your encounters, or you just didn't plan your whole adventure around one battle, and you don't happen to have one of those 2 or 3 available counters, it can be pretty much impossible to beat him with any amount of consistency. At least, that's the impression I've always had, and I decided to put it to the test. Between Ruby and Sapphire put together, there are exactly 39 Pokemon available prior to earning the Dynamo badge, and I tested every single one of them in order to see just how small is the pool of Pokemon that can reliably get the player past Wattson. Maybe the most poorly balanced gym leader in the entire mainline series. Before we begin testing Pokemon, I want to explain 2 things. First, what exactly is it that makes Wattson such a massive obstacle, and second, how exactly is the test going to be conducted? To answer the first question, Wattson is mainly a problem because of one particular Pokemon he has on his team, his ace, Magneton. Objectively speaking, no matter how you slice it, this Magneton is, in fact, an unfair Pokemon for him to have. It's only level 23. Magnemite isn't supposed to evolve until level 30. Yeah, it's not uncommon in this series for NPC trainers, especially bosses, to have Pokemon evolved at impossible levels, but it's not usually this egregious, and especially this early on. Most examples come up towards the end of the adventure, where chances are your team are all fully evolved anyway. However, it's not just Magneton's fully evolved stats which are the issue, it's also its electric steel typing. In the Generation 3 type chart, there are only 4 types that aren't resisted by this combination: Fire, Fighting, Water, and Ground. Out of these 39 Pokemon, do you know how many of them learn at least one damaging move of any of those 4 types by level up in time for Wattson's gym? 8, including Aeron's Mud Slap and Masquerain's Bubble. The only TMs or HMs of those types available at this point in the game are the 20 base power Rock Smash, or Flamethrower, which is actually really helpful, at least on paper, but locked behind the game corner. More on that later. Plus, on top of everything else, he uses 2 Super Potions, which are effectively full restores this early in the game. Unless you get him to use them up on his earlier Pokemon, or you have a move that deals enough damage to dodge around the range of health that triggers his AI to heal, which, for the reasons listed above, is relatively hard to come by, you effectively have to be able to whittle down Magneton's health 3 times. The way I conducted the test was by setting up a situation in which his Magneton was at full health, the player had a safe switch into it, and Wattson still had both his Super Potions, and then creating a save state at that moment. It's not a perfect simulation of how a typical face-off against this Magneton would go. You're not always going to have a safe switch into it, especially if you're playing a Nuzlocke and don't want to sack anything, but I figured if a Pokemon can't do it even with the best possible tempo, it's pretty safe to assume that they can't do it, period. They were all tested at Watson's level cap, with neutral natures, no EVs, and 15 IVs in every stat. Also, I'm assuming the player isn't using bag items, because at least in theory, you can win virtually any fight by potion spamming. I would usually give a Pokemon around 10 attempts, sometimes a little more if I felt they were getting egregiously lucky or unlucky, and sorted them into tiers based on how frequently they were able to 1v1 the Magneton. Not to get too ahead of myself, but the bottom 3, and especially the bottom 2 tiers, are probably going to be very full. Grovyle has 3 things going for them in this fight. They resist electric-type moves, meaning Magneton's Shockwave isn't that big a problem for them. They learn Screech, allowing them to lower Magneton's physical defense. And they get a free turn at the start of the battle, since Magneton will always try to paralyze Pokemon that are faster than them, which can just be healed off with a Cherry Berry. Unfortunately, this means Grovyle is going to get paralyzed still, since there is no way they are going to be able to take out the Magneton before they simply use Thunder Wave again the next turn, because the best physical move they get to take advantage of the lower defense is Rock Smash. Even if the fight goes perfectly, Grovyle never hits themselves in confusion, they never get fully paralyzed, and Screech never misses, Grovyle is still probably going to have to hope for a defense drop or 2 from Rock Smash in order to take out the Magneton before they simply run out of health, which is not very likely. When even a Pokemon with that much going for them on paper can still be completely walled by this fight, I'm sure you can imagine how some of these other Pokemon struggled. Combusken was difficult to rank. Out of all the Pokemon in this video, Combusken is the one that I spent by far the longest time testing, and it's probably going to be the one that I spend by far the longest time talking about. There are 2 main strategies Combusken can use against this Magneton. The first is by far the more reliable one, just use the Flamethrower TM. Yeah, unless your Combusken has really good special attack, it's a range for it to OHKO, but even if Magneton survives, it'll then just get stuck in a potion loop, because the AI seems to prioritize healing above everything else, even when they roll a KO with one of their Pokemon's moves. It doesn't get Combusken the sweep, Voltorb survives Flamethrower, and then it's probably just going to blow up the next turn. It's also not a guaranteed win against Magneton. Combusken is slower, so they could get confused or paralyzed and subsequently be unable to attack, but Combusken's win rate with the Flamethrower TM was leagues better than almost everything else I tested. The only problem is that you are probably not getting the Flamethrower TM. This is going to be a bit of a tangent, but I promise it's a very important part of the discussion, not just to Combusken, but to many other Pokemon in this video. The Flamethrower TM can only be purchased with coins from the mobile game corner. You're probably not going to be able to afford to just buy all of the necessary coins this early in the adventure, especially since at this point in the game there's no way to rematch trainers. The only renewable source of money available is getting nuggets via pickup. Hope you enjoy spending several hours running around with a bunch of Zigzagoon. You can't even reliably grind coins by winning them in the minigames. The roulette gives you nothing, and while in most games where they appear, the slot machines have a bit of a timing game to them, I swear in the Hoenn games it's just pure luck. This is unverified, but I found an old GameFAQs thread where someone claimed to have observed the slot machine's wheel spin frame by frame, and said that most of the time, after getting 2 7s, there simply wasn't a frame where the 7 on the third wheel lined up with the other 2 7s, making it impossible to win on that spin. This game corner is the reason I've had to split every tier into 2 sections. One for Pokemon that made the tier using only their level up learn sets, or TMs and HMs that are easily obtained, and one for Pokemon that were only able to make the tier using moves they can only learn via these TMs, because having to deal with this is worthy of a pretty massive asterisk. Despite this fight happening several hours in, it's genuinely probably faster to just reset the entire game and try for better encounters than it is to grind coins for these TMs. The other main strategy Combusken can use is Double Kick, which consistently 2-shots the Magneton. The problem faced by other Pokemon that consistently 2-shot Magneton is that they were slower, and Magneton could 2-shot them with Shockwave. They could win sometimes because Magneton wasn't guaranteed to go for Shockwave on the first turn, but if they did, it was pretty much an automatic loss. because the AI will virtually always go for a KO when they roll one, and the first Shockwave would put them in range. Combusken seemed to be one of these at first, however late in my testing I realized that having Combusken hold an Oranberry turns it into a range, but a very favourable one, for Combusken to survive 2 Shockwaves. I tried to get the exact percentage from a damage calculator, but unfortunately it doesn't take the Oranberry healing into account. If you want to do the math yourself, here are the numbers. This does mean you're not holding the Cherry Berry to protect from paralysis, but as far as my testing showed, this was the item that gave better results. And on top of everything that's already been discussed with Combusken, there's the looming fact that no matter what kind of prep work you do, every single time Magneton has a chance to use a move, there's a 1 in 16 chance that Combusken just loses, because a crit Shockwave KOs even from full health. The complications just do not end with this chicken, and I have to cut this off somewhere. With the Flamethrower TM, the win rate was around 90-ish%, making it a semi-consistent 1v1 versus Magneton. With Double Kick, it was around 50-ish%, making it a shaky counter. With Double Kick plus Oranberry, it was around 70-ish%, making it less shaky, but still kinda shaky. Marshtomp is exactly what I mean when I say that Wattson completely warps the game's entire meta. Despite not even being much of a standout next to the other 2 starters for the entire rest of the adventure, and even by many accounts performing noticeably worse than the others in some parts of the late game, Mudkip has basically always been considered the only valid starter choice for both Nuzlocke and speedruns. It ranks towards the top of nearly every Hoenn encounter and starter performance tier list pretty much exclusively because it's really good in this one fight. Ground types can turn Wattson's Magneton from one of the most broken, unfair Pokemon a boss has ever been given in this series into a total joke, and Marshtomp is one of only 2.5 available to the player at this point in the adventure. Magneton can't even paralyze ground types. The only way they can pose even a little bit of a threat is by confusing them. And if you aren't just spamming like I was while testing, you can easily cure that by switching out. Marshtomp not only very consistently 1v1s Magneton, it pretty consistently sweeps the entire fight. So that's how the starters fare. One that basically makes the battle free, one that can kind of, sort of, but not really, but maybe somewhat close to consistently 1v1 the Magneton, and one that needs to get really lucky. If you're playing casually, Combusken would probably get it in a few attempts at most, but if you pick Torchic and you're playing a Nuzlocke, where you can't really be taking risks like that unless you have no other option, or if you picked Trico regardless of your personal rule set, you're probably going to want to find your answer to this gym elsewhere. Well, you're not going to be finding it with Mightyena. Sand Attack doesn't help at all because Magneton's main attacking move bypasses accuracy checks. The only move they learn to hit Magneton with is Rock Smash. Even getting really lucky with defense drops, or with Magneton not attacking enough times to set up a few howls, Mightyena wasn't able to defeat them a single time. Linoone went similarly. They were able to hit harder right off the bat with a same type attack bonus Headbutt, and they were able to lower defense consistently using Tail Whip, but unlike Mightyena, Linoone does not learn any attack boosting moves at this level, meaning they did about the same damage, if not less, in the end. So the first 2 non-starter Pokemon both simply cannot do it. However, they are not in the lowest tier of Pokemon I tested. Before testing Pokemon against the Magneton, I had a bit of a pilot study to see which ones were even worth looking at. Wattson leads with a Magnemite, which is essentially the same as his ace, but a lot less powerful. Same typing, same ability, lower stats but with similar distribution, same moveset except with a less powerful electric type move. Nearly a third of the Pokemon I tested couldn't even defeat this Magnemite, including all of the next 6. Beautifly, Dustox, Lombre, Nuzleaf, Swellow, even with Guts activated, and Wingull. And I don't mean they couldn't defeat the Magnemite consistently, I mean they couldn't defeat them at all. I gave each of them several attempts. The Pokemon that couldn't even pass the practice exam belong in a tier of their own at the very bottom. Kirlia was the first non-starter that was actually able to defeat the Magneton within the allotted attempts, albeit they needed a TM from the game corner to pull it off. One of the issues faced by Kirlia is that they have very little HP, meaning Sonic Boom from Magneton is almost as big a threat as Shockwave is. To beat the Magneton, Kirlia needs time to set up 3 Calm Minds and use Psychic twice, which can only happen if Magneton misses with Supersonic or gets fully paralyzed. Kirlia has Synchronize at least once, and Kirlia doesn't get fully paralyzed or hit themselves in confusion a single time. And even assuming Kirlia gets all of that opportunity to act, the 2 Sidekicks are a range to KO. I was almost tempted to disqualify Kirlia's wins, because both times they beat Magneton in my testing, they crit. However, one of those crits was from full health, indicating 2 decent rolls can in fact KO. And there were other attempts where Kirlia got the 5 turns they needed. So I guess if you combine those 2, it shows that Kirlia can do it, but it's probably the most unlikely out of all Pokemon that made the unlikely tier. For Masquerain, I took exactly 1 note. It reads, its attacking moves are Bubble and Quick Attack. Breloom is pretty much the encounter you want to roll if you didn't pick Mudkip, because it is one of the only Pokemon aside from the Water-type starter that both withstands Magneton's Shockwave and learns a pretty hard-hitting super effective move. Mach Punch may only be 40 base power, but with same type attack bonus and Breloom's very high attack stat for this point in the adventure, it easily 2-shots the Magneton. Not only that, Mach Punch one-shots Magnemite, and Breloom takes even self-destruct from Voltorb surprisingly well, meaning aside from crits, the only way they can possibly lose is getting confused by Magneton, or, as long as Breloom holds a Cherry Berry, getting paralyzed by both Voltorb and Magneton, which Voltorb can only do as a secondary effect from Spark. The only issue with Breloom as a counter to this gym is, like Marshtomp, they basically have to be planned from the start of the adventure, as they're only found up to level 6 in the very first dungeon of the game. Vigoroth is another Pokemon that can only sometimes defeat the Magneton if they get a lot of turns to set up. Unlike Kirlia, though, Vigoroth has a way of making this happen a bit more consistently. Magneton will basically always attempt to paralyze any Pokemon that's faster than them, which Vigoroth is. Vigoroth can then Encore Magneton into Thunder Wave, and use the several free turns to set up a bunch of bulk ups, which you get the TM for from Brawly's gym. Unfortunately, like so many others, the best damaging move Vigoroth has to use is Rock Smash, meaning they have to set up a lot of bulk ups, and Encore has to last a really long time for this to work out. And especially since Vigoroth is going to be paralyzed and therefore be unable to move on some turns, since Magneton is locked into Thunder Wave, there usually just isn't enough time. Alakazam consistently sweeps the entire fight, as long as you use the Psychic TM from the game corner. Despite Magneton resisting the move, it has such high base power and Alakazam has such high special attack that it's almost always a 3-shot. Without the Psychic TM, it can sometimes still 1v1 the Magneton, but it's quite unlikely. It's not even that it can't outdamage the Magneton this way, it's more that Psybeam doesn't dodge around Wattson's heal range like Psykick does. I mentioned the Super Potions earlier, but I do think it deserves more emphasis that for so many Pokemon, this was really the only reason they couldn't 1v1 the Magneton. Ninjask is a flying type, and it does not learn a single move that steel types don't resist. Surprisingly, they actually were able to get a win against the Magnemite by setting up a few Screeches and using Cut, but since Magneton OHKOs with Shockwave, that's about as far as they got. Shedinja has an interesting gimmick. Their ability Wonder Guard renders them completely immune to any damaging move that isn't super effective, meaning Magneton cannot damage them directly. The problem is, Shedinja also can't really deal any substantial damage to Magneton. Plus, while Shedinja can't be hit by non-super effective attacks, it can absolutely be hit by status moves, meaning Magneton is definitely going to hit with Supersonic, and Shedinja will just take themselves out with confusion damage long before they get anywhere close to taking down Magneton. Now, alternatively, you can use the strategy that usually causes people to completely ban Shedinja from Nuzlocke and completely stall the Magneton out of Supersonic PP by switching between Shedinja and another Pokemon, preferably one that can't be paralyzed, which takes a really long time to do, by the way, but it does mean that you now have a Magneton that is completely unable to do anything to this Shedinja. Now, however long it takes, eventually this Magneton will fall. Oh, Shedinja ran out of attacks. I thought about teaching Shedinja a third attacking move just for the extra PP and setting all of that up again. However, a couple of turns later, Magneton ran out of attacks themselves and KO'd Shedinja with Struggle, which ignores the effects of Wonder Guard. This was before Wattson had even used the second Super Potion, by the way, so I don't think this was happening regardless. The best thing Shedinja can provide on this fight is allowing one of your other Pokemon to deal with this now struggling Magneton a bit more easily. You know, assuming you're willing to spend like 80 turns setting that up. I guess before I move on from these two, I should mention that their pre-evolved form is a ground type. However, Nincada does not learn any ground-type moves, so that's pointless. We just saw with Shedinja that immunity alone isn't enough. If you give Loudred the Flamethrower TM, they can two-shot the Magneton. It's actually quite a similar scenario to double-kick Combusken, only with a far more unfavorable range for your Pokemon to take two shockwaves. I don't know why Wattson's AI doesn't seem to prioritize it always, since it is the highest damaging move, but if Magneton does use Shockwave on the first turn, even if Loudred holds an Oranberry, chances are it's just a loss. And without the Flamethrower TM, Loudred couldn't even defeat the Magnemite. Makuhita, despite having the type advantage and a half-decent move for a change, was simply too frail. Any attack from Magneton, or one self-hit in Confusion, would immediately put Makuhita into Shockwave KO range. The only way they could ever win was with Magneton attempting to confuse them, and then either missing, or Makuhita not hitting themselves in Confusion on either turn. Having Guts activated did not improve their win rate. In fact, if anything, it worsened it, because the extra damage from Burn and Poison caused Makuhita to go down in one turn instead of two. I don't know if the AI takes residual damage into account, but Wattson seemed to go for Shockwave a lot more consistently during this phase of testing. I guess I could have tried again with Paralysis instead of Burn, but Guts Vital Throw misses the KO anyway, so even ignoring the possibility of full Paralysis, it seems like at best it would have the same win ratio as it would without Guts. Now, if this were Emerald, and Makuhita was allowed to evolve without overleveling, that would be a very different story, but as it is, they just aren't a viable answer. Goldeen is a pure water type, putting it at a type disadvantage against Wattson's electric types. They also don't actually learn any water type moves at this level, meaning they can't even hit the Magnemite for neutral damage. Gyarados was only able to defeat the Magnemite using the Flamethrower TM from the game corner. Against Magneton, they outspeed and two-shot with Flamethrower, but are subsequently one-shot by Shockwave. Again, the AI will always go for a KO when it rolls one, so there's no chance of Magneton going for a different move. The only way Gyarados can beat Magneton is with a crit, and when a Pokemon requires a crit to win, that disqualifies them in my book. Azumarill is another pure water type. This one actually learns a decent water type move, but not decent enough, I'm afraid. Probably the biggest surprise with Geodude is that, despite being a ground type, they actually do not reliably sweep the entire fight. If Magnemite and Voltorb both attack with Sonic Boom, which they are very likely to since their electric type moves are ineffective, Magneton can then easily finish Geodude off with their own Sonic Boom. You can give Geodude an extra turn with an Oranberry, but even this doesn't make the fight completely safe, as Wattson's Pokemon, even the first two, can withstand a low magnitude. Geodude is likely to sweep, but they lost enough times that I don't know if I could confidently put them in the top tier. Just 1v1ing Magneton, however, they didn't lose a single time. Just like Shroomish, though, Geodude is only available in one early game dungeon prior to Wattson's Gym, at quite a low level. Now, we have 3 more Pokemon in a row that couldn't defeat the Magnemite: Skitty, Crobat, and Tentacool. Before we get into Sableye, who actually looked pretty interesting on paper. Sableye learns a fixed damage move in Nightshade, which ignores type effectiveness. Unfortunately, Sableye is also very frail. Nightshade consistently 3-shots, and you don't even have to worry about damage ranges, but Magneton needs to not use a damaging move on at least 2 out of those 3 turns. And Sableye can't hit themselves in confusion a single time. Otherwise, Shockwave KO range, you get it by now. Mawile is another Pokemon that can sometimes take on Magneton using the Flamethrower TM from the Game Corner. While their Flamethrower doesn't consistently 2-shot, if they use Fake Tears to lower Magneton's special defense, and then use Flamethrower, it will either OHKO or get Wattson stuck in a heal loop. Remember, the AI prioritizes healing above all else, even moves that KO. However, out of all these shaky answers, Mawile is probably the shakiest of all. Just like Combusken and Loudred, they get 2-shot by Shockwave, but unlike those two, unless you roll especially good HP and special defense IVs, there is no range where Mawile can survive 2 Shockwaves even with an Oranberry. If Magneton uses Shockwave turn 1, that's just it. Aeron will also lose the next turn, if not sooner, if Magneton uses Shockwave a single time, except Aeron's best move for this Magneton is Mud Slap. Aeron actually was able to defeat the Magneton once due to Magneton never attacking and their status moves repeatedly missing because of the accuracy drops. But the accuracy drops only do so much, because, again, Shockwave bypasses accuracy checks. This competes with Kirlia for being the most unlikely out of all the unlikely candidates. Meditite is a Pokemon that you would think would look promising, with its type advantage and ability that doubles its attack stat. However, I'm sure you've guessed already, the best move Meditite gets to take advantage of all this is Rock Smash. Even if Meditite did get a better move, it would still probably be a shaky answer at best. They are quite frail. As they are, they did not come close to defeating Magneton a single time. For Electrike to even defeat the Magnemite, it needed the Thunderbolt TM from the Game Corner. Plusle was the biggest surprise in all of my testing, who subsequently became the biggest disappointment. Here's what I mean. I was fully expecting Plusle to make no headway with this Magneton whatsoever, but I did start experimenting with a really convoluted strategy where Plusle would paralyze Magneton, let Magneton paralyze them, encore Magneton into Thunderwave, and then see if they could outdamage Magneton with that head start. In a perfect world, they obviously could, but like so many others, Plusle ran into the problem that, when Magneton's health got low, Wattson would just heal it with a super potion. However, I noticed that if Plusle used Thunderbolt, it did a larger chunk of Magneton's health than I was expecting. If they were to deal damage to Magneton very specifically, swapping between Thunderbolt and Spark, could they maybe avoid the range of health that would trigger Wattson to heal? And it worked. Using Thunderbolt, 3 Sparks, and another Thunderbolt, Plusle was able to finish off Magneton from outside of Wattson's usual heal range. They pulled this off twice in a row, and I was getting legit excited. Was this consistent? Did I just find a sleeper reliable Magneton counter? However, of course it wasn't. Even ignoring the fact that this is being done with a Game Corner TM, there's obviously the possibility that Plusle could just get fully paralyzed too many times, or that Encore simply wouldn't last long enough. And worst of all, the Thunderbolt, 3 Sparks, and another Thunderbolt turned out to be a range. Sometimes the last Thunderbolt wouldn't KO, or sometimes the 3rd Spark would put Magneton into heal range. I don't know what the exact percentage is, it's difficult enough to calculate across 2 turns, let alone 4 or 5, but from my testing, it did not seem very favorable. I think the initial 2 wins in a row was a bit of a fluke. Plus, getting a crit on any turn would completely mess up the setup, and also, even if this Plusle could consistently avoid the heal range, that would not mean that every Plusle could. The amount of damage done by Spark and Thunderbolt is going to vary based on Plusle's IVs and nature, which are always going to be different. So, without getting really lucky, the best thing Plusle can do is lock Magneton into Thunderwave with Encore, and maybe give one of your other Pokemon more of a fighting chance. Minun is the exact same way, except ranked a bit lower because, unlike Plusle, they were never able to take down Magneton on their own. Minun has a slightly lower special attack stat, so they simply couldn't deal enough damage to dodge Wattson's heal range. Volbeat gets a really good setup move in Tail Glow, however the only move he gets this early on that takes advantage of it is Thunderbolt from the game corner. This was the only way he was able to beat Magnemite, and against Magneton, even in the extremely unlikely event Volbeat gets enough turns to set this up, a completely maxed out Thunderbolt misses the 2-shot. And Illumise is the exact same way, except she doesn't get Tail Glow. Gloom's only attacking moves at this point in the game are Absorb and Bullet Seed. They could just manage a win against the Magnemite by repeatedly putting them to sleep, but the same strategy was not enough to make any headway against Magneton, even getting really lucky with Sleep Powder accuracy. Roselia is probably the closest thing I found to a sleeper answer to this Magneton in all of my testing. They learn Growth and a slightly stronger Grass-type move in Mega Drain, but what actually makes Roselia surprisingly viable in this fight is the fact that they learn Leech Seed. It's slightly inaccurate, which is annoying, but if Roselia is able to set this up, it takes away an eighth of Magneton's health every turn, more damage than many attacking moves at this point in the adventure would do, and restores that health to Roselia, or whatever Pokemon the player has out. It's probably smartest to just have Roselia set this up for support, but they can 1v1 Magneton themselves sometimes, if they don't hit themselves in confusion or get fully paralyzed too many times. I'd say Roselia is the first Pokemon since Combusken that I'd consider a shaky answer using only their level up learn set, rather than being dependent on game corner TMs. And, in Pokedex order, the very last Pokemon available prior to Wattson's gym battle is Gulpin. A pure poison type, against a steel type. Yeah. The biggest surprise with Gulpin is that they weren't one of the 30% of all available Pokemon that couldn't even pass the practice exam. They actually were able to defeat the Magnemite by putting them to sleep with Yawn and using Rock Smash. However, they get 2-shot by Magneton's Shockwave. Even with the best possible luck, they're never going to be able to whittle down Magneton's health in time. And that's it. Out of the 39 Pokemon available prior to Wattson's gym battle across Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire put together, we have 3 that can at least semi-consistently 1v1 the Magneton. You can increase it to 5 if you count Pokemon that can only do it with the elusive Game Corner TMs. 2 that can win maybe 50 to 70% of the time, but you'd really only want to have as your Magneton counter if you have absolutely no other choice. You can increase it to 4 if you count Pokemon that need the Game Corner TMs to clear this bar. A few more that have to get really lucky, to the point where they're hardly even worth considering for this fight, and 2/3 of them being completely unable to defeat Magneton at all. Shroomish has a 15% encounter rate in one location, and Geodude has a 10% encounter rate in one location. So overall, if you didn't pick Mudkip, you have a less than 25% chance of rolling a reliable counter to that Magneton. I can certainly think of other boss fights in this series that I consider to be more difficult, like Claire's Kingdra. Can't get around that by simply having a type advantage on your team. However, I don't think I can think of another that is this specific in what it basically requires the player to have on their team. Wattson really sticks out like a sore thumb compared to how well designed most of the other gym leader boss fights are in the Hoenn region. I've mentioned a few times how there are almost no ground types or ground type moves, the only super effective type on Electric available prior to this battle. The gym leaders of the Hoenn region all seem intentionally designed to make it tougher for the player to sweep through their team. However, Magneton's secondary steel type and being impossibly evolved just takes it too far. As we've seen, it really min-maxes the potential of every Pokemon in this fight to an absurd degree. The very next gym leader, Flannery, basically takes the same design principle, but does it a lot better and is maybe one of the best designed boss fights in the whole series. She specializes in fire types. The player doesn't get access to many water, ground, or rock type Pokemon or moves before her fight. But unlike with Wattson, the few you are given aren't immediately shot up to being among the most desirable encounters in the game, because while the player isn't given many good super effective moves, they're given plenty of decent neutral moves. Like, sure, don't give the player the Dig TM, and while you're at it, maybe don't give Marshtomp Mudshot as well, if you don't want players to plow through his team. But like, give Wattson different electric types that the average Pokemon the player has access to at this point in the game can at least hit for neutral damage. I don't even know how to wrap this up. This was a really random and specific topic, but it's a bone I've had to pick with the Hoenn games for a really long time, and I couldn't get into it as much as I wanted in my review of Ruby and Sapphire without utterly destroying the pace of that video. Maybe I should just go tell you to watch that now for my broader thoughts on those games. Or not, it's up to you. Bye.